In 66 AD, there was a revolt in Palestine that was centered around Caesarea Maritime, city on the Mediterranean coast. And the locals had burnt a synagogue, and there was great unrest. And all this had been brewing for the last 20 years, since Syria had taken over governorship of Palestine. So the Syrians in authority had been antagonistic towards the Jewish people who lived there in Palestine. They were making things awkward for them. And so there was this final eruption, a revolt. And the Emperor Nero sent out the General Vespasian to go and sort the problem out with his army. So they came along to Palestine, but Nero died. And so the army encamped there, but didn't do very much. Then there was a succession of short-lived emperors. And then finally, Vespasian himself, the general who'd been sent out, he was elected to be the new Caesar. And so he sent his own son, Titus, to be in command of the army and go out and sort out this revolt that was going on in Palestine at the time. That was in 70 AD. And that was a catastrophe for the Jewish people. They destroyed Jerusalem. They reduced the temple to complete ruins and burnt everything that in it would burn. Everybody who was in there was massacred as far as the Romans could do so. And they did the same in other places like Masada, where we know the Romans besieged Masada, which was a city built on the hilltop right down near the Red Sea. And gradually the Roman army built a ramp going up there. And when they got there, everybody was dead, because the Jews decided it was better to kill each other than to be submitted to the Romans, who would really butcher them in a nasty kind of way. So the ones who did the butchering then killed each other, and the last one then killed himself. But there was one woman who survived, actually, and hid. So that was a terrible and great influence on the Jewish people in the late 1st century AD. Then they had to decide, what were they going to do? How were they going to live as Jews? Because their faith had been built on the land, the promised land that had been given to by the Lord, and on temple sacrifice, and the temple and priesthood were now obliterated. So they had to start thinking, how are we going to live our lives as Jews? What does it mean to be a faithful Jew? So the rabbis who were left, who were the scribes and the Pharisees, particularly at Japhnia, had to try and work out a new way, based on what they call Mishnah, which was an interpretation of the law, and how they could live all the Jewish feasts without the mainstays of Judaism, of the land and the temple. Now, the Christians in Palestine at the time, many of them were Jews, and they were living alongside their fellow Jews, and they were going to the synagogue, going to the temple before its destruction, but they were also celebrating the Eucharist, and they also accepted Jesus as the Messiah. And so they were involved in all this turmoil as well. There's a tradition, and in fact they were warned and in some kind of prophecy to leave Jerusalem before the destruction, and went to the Transjordania on the other side of the Jordan. But then they had to live as well, and they were trying to say, along with all the other Jewish groups, about saying this is the correct way, this is the right way to be a good Jew. And all of this then helps us to understand Matthew's Gospel. So Matthew was writing for the Jewish Christians at the time. He probably wrote shortly after the destruction of the temple. And it was very important that he wrote to them, because alongside all the others who were writing apocryphal literature, what we call pseudo-epigraphica, that's an important word to learn because you get lots of points in Scrabble. So they were all writing here, trying to justify their position and saying, well, this is the true way to live. And so the Christian Jews were also trying to defend their place and saying, we're not a threat to Judaism. You know, this is an authentic interpretation of Judaism, seeing that Jesus is the Messiah. So that's the kind of location of Matthew's Gospel. So when we read Matthew's Gospel, it's important to bear this in mind. Why was he writing things? What was he trying to say? Why was he giving so much about saying this is to fulfill the scriptures and so on? The reason was because he was addressing a community who were living with other Jews who were not necessarily messianic in the sense of accepting Jesus as the Messiah. They weren't Christian Jews, but they were living with them, and they had to defend their position. For there's so much in all of the text of Matthew's Gospel that this sheds light upon, and this is one example. Right, so we've got this wonderful passage that's often used for funerals. It's quite familiar to us, isn't it? I bless you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, for hiding these things from the learned and the clever. So if we look at it now from that perspective of the Christian Jewish community trying to explain themselves and say, yes, you can be an authentic Jew and be a Christian as well. So what do we see here? First of all, Jesus is saying a prayer that's typically Jewish. To say, I bless you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, is a typical Jewish beginning of a prayer. So we find that in the Psalms, we find it in the Qumran scrolls, we find it in pseudo-epigraphica of Baruch and Ezra. It's a good Jewish way of praying. And then he goes on to say why he's blessing God. He says, for hiding these things from the learned and the clever and the revealing them to mere children. The word for children there is like nipper. It's a nepiois. It's rather fun, actually. So revealing it to mere children. And this was really important because Matthew here was dealing with people who were trying to direct the Jewish community into a new way with a new mission, a new understanding of the law. And Jesus had already revealed this had been passed on, and he thought this was really significant to put this down in his gospel, that it was to the humble people and not just to those who were well versed in the Hebrew scriptures, who could say that they could understand Jesus and his teaching. So it was open to everybody, not just the elite scribes and so on, people who read Greek. And then he says, yes, Father, that is what you pleased you to do. And then it looks like we've got another piece of Jesus' prayer because it's now directed to the people he's looking at rather than talking to God. So there's another little piece that Matthew's joined together. Everything has been entrusted to be by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, just as no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. That rings a bell, doesn't it? I mean, John's Gospel, which we've had recently, when everything has been entrusted to the Son by the Father, and those to whom he chooses to reveal himself. So again, we have a kind of divine thing here, not putting it so explicitly, but certainly having a unity between the Father and the Son. And then we've got a finer little piece here that's only found in Matthew's Gospel. Come to me, all you who labour and are overburdened, and I will give you rest. Well, apart from the fact that it's a wonderful prayer because Jesus is showing that he is humble, in fact, he's fulfilling what he said. Blessed are, in the Beatitudes early in Matthew's Gospel, the gentle and the humble in heart were two of the Beatitudes. In fact, what we got here is a Hebrew poetic style. And he's done this deliberately so that the people who are listening can understand actually this is authentic Jewish teaching. And it's called a chiasmus. So it's based on the Greek letter chi, which looks like an X. So that's the way the beginning of the word Christos, it begins with a chi. And because if you look at it when it's printed out, you can draw a line between the same words in a passage and they form a kind of X pattern. So you've got to use a bit of imagination here. So I will give you rest, right? And then we've got rest for your souls. So at the beginning and the end is the rest. Oh, sorry, before that we've got burden, haven't we? So overburdened, and the same word is used for my burden is light. In fact, it's what we call a cognate, it's the noun, and then we've got the verb as well. But we connect them up together because they've got the same root letters. And then we've got rest. That's sort of burden on this end and burden on the other end of the text. And then we've got in here rest and rest. That's for your souls. And right in the middle of all this is the yoke. So that is a typical Hebrew way of talking, Hebrew way of teaching, and we find it in the Psalms and the prayers as well. It's very common in John, particularly in his prologue. So Matthew is using a Hebrew device to show that this teaching is authentic teaching. But there's something else that's Hebrew in here as well, which is the yoke. And the law was commonly described as the yoke, to put on the yoke of the law. So Jesus' law, his yoke, is an alternative to that of the rabbis that going before Jesus' time, but especially now we find in Matthew's new community in the Hebrew teaching that the others were giving, the other rabbis and so on, and after 70 AD were giving a new yoke of the law, how to live the law without the temple, how to live the law without the promised land, because that's been taken away from them. And then Jesus is giving a yoke as well. So this is the alternative. So it's authentic Jewish yoke. You can be a good Jew and to be a Christian. Now, a yoke, I do a bit of woodwork, so I know a little bit about wood. So if you're making a yoke, I don't make them for oxes actually. But anyway, if you make a yoke, what you do is the person brings along the ox, or you go and visit them, if they pay a bit more, I expect, and you start to fit the yoke. And you want it to be a good yoke, a good fit, because your ox will work better at pulling the plough if it's a good fit. So it's a bit like saying, you want nice clothes, and if you've got, a suit, then I can't afford them, but if you could afford them, you go to a tailor and have them tailor-made so they fit properly, so you're comfortable wearing your suit. Now, the word that Jesus uses for easy is in fact a good fit. It's a bit like saying tailor-made. So this yoke that he offers is tailor-made. It's tailor-made for you, just like the yoke is made for your ox there, that's tailor-made, so that it works well. So what Jesus is saying here in this text, and Matthew's repeating, is that to follow his law is not so much easy because you don't have to try. We do have to try, but it's a good fit. It's tailor-made for us. The law that he gives us, his interpretation of the law, his or fulfillment of the law, his yoke, is a good fit for us. And it's a light burden in the sense that he ain't heavy, he's my brother kind of thing. Remember that song? I can't remember who sang it. But anyway, he ain't heavy, he's my brother. I won't try and sing it. So this is the same kind of idea. Yes, it is a burden, but we willingly bear it because it's good and we realize it's good for us. So here we've got this wonderful passage at the end of Matthew chapter 8, which is preceded by controversies. So this one here is actually slightly controversial, because we've got, obviously, Jesus is praying to his Father as an intimate relationship with God that eventually we discover is because he is divine himself. But we've also got an understanding that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law, and you can be a good Jew and a good Christian.